It's the Real News Network, and I'm Ben Norton. France's centrist president has come under heated criticism for honoring a World War I general who later became the leader of France's Nazi-occupied Vichy regime. This comes at the time when U.S. President Donald Trump is taking a trip to France to join other world leaders commemorating the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I. French President Emmanuel Macron announced on November 7th that he planned to commemorate Marshal Philippe Pétain. This is a French general who was to be commemorated for his role in leading the French army during the 9-month Battle of Verdun in World War I. He eventually helped defeat the German army at the cost of about 140,000 German troops and more than 210,000 French troops who were killed in the battle, which is probably the most notorious battle of the First World War. However, Pétain's career was not over after World War I, and the Second World War, when Germany invaded France and conquered Paris, as well as the northern and middle parts of the country, the south of France surrendered to the Nazi German Empire. The notorious Vichy regime was established in the south of France, while also presiding over the French colonies in North Africa, which were crucial to the Nazi war effort in their advance toward Egypt. And Henri-Philippe Pétain was appointed the chief of state of the Nazi Vichy government between 1940 and 1944. He was therefore the highest-ranking French Nazi collaborator. Macron's decision to honor Pétain caused an uproar inside France, where during the recent presidential election, the chief opponent of Macron, the far-right leader Marine Le Pen, actually caused a similar scandal when she argued that France bears no responsibility for the crimes committed against Jews during World War II, only the individuals who were in charge at the time. She tried to distinguish the two. Pétain, as the leader, would be complicit in sending Jews to concentration camps. In response to this backlash, the Macron administration backtracked and claimed that now it will not honor Pétain this weekend at its 100th anniversary commemoration of World War I. In an attempt to calm the fires, President Macron gave a short statement to the press on Thursday. Here's that clip.
Les victimes de cet État. Et de l'autre côté, j'y regarde l'histoire en face et je l'ai dit hier. Il y a un maréchal Pétain qui a été un des acteurs et des grands soldats de 14-18. Et ça, vous ne pouvez pas l'effacer. Et donc, j'ai simplement dit, on n'efface pas l'histoire. On n'est pas les procureurs de l'histoire. Ensuite, il n'a jamais été question de l'honorer individuellement. Et donc, ce que j'ai toujours dit, voulu et fait, c'est que les maréchaux avec l'armée sont honorés. Et qu'il n'y a pas de célébration ou d'hommage individuel de Pétain, comme c'est le cas depuis Jacques Chirac.
So joining us to get more context for this and to understand the historical context, we are speaking with Adam Hochschild. Adam Hochschild is a renowned historian, journalist, and author. He is the author of 9 books. His latest, Lessons from a Dark Time and Other Essays, was published this October. And he also has a book on World War I, which was published in 2011, titled To End All Wars, A Story of Loyalty and Rebellion, 1914 to 1918. Thanks for joining us, Adam.
Good to be with you, Ben.
So can you respond to this, and let's talk about the context. I mean, there's a lot to address. First, before we get to the context of World War I, of the Battle of Verdun, of who exactly, what exactly Macron is honoring, let's just talk a little bit about Pétain's role during World War II, and specifically as the leader of the Nazi collaborating Vichy regime.
Well, Pétain is a peculiar character in French history because he was very much a hero during the First World War to French people and a villain during the Second. During the Second World War, he was the leader of Vichy France. That is, as you said, the regime which collaborated with the Germans, most notoriously assisting the Germans in rounding up French Jews by the hundreds of thousands, including Jews from other parts of Europe who'd taken refuge in France and who had not been able to get out of France because the United States and other countries were not hospitable to them. And they were sent to concentration camps with the aid of police who were reporting to Marshal Pétain. So I think he deserves a pretty ignominious place in history for that. And in fact, after the war, he was sentenced to death for his collaboration with the Germans. Then the sentence was commuted to life imprisonment, and he died in custody at the age of 95 or so. During the First World War, he was a great military hero to France, in large part because he was able to suppress and defuse a mutiny which broke out in the French army in 1917, where tens of thousands of soldiers refused orders to go into battle. One group hijacked a train and tried to drive it back to Paris. They, for the most part, stayed in their trenches, but said they would not take part in further suicidal attacks, these human wave attacks over the tops of the trenches, in which soldiers were just mown down like stalks of hay. Pétain very shrewdly defused this. Some mutineers were punished, some were sentenced to punishment, to be shot, but then their sentences were commuted, so the soldiers ended up grateful to him. He increased the quality of the army's food, he made sure that soldiers got leave, and this mutinous spirit in the army calmed down. And that was really his great achievement. Winning the Battle of Verdun, when there are hundreds of thousands of soldiers who were killed on both sides and very little territory was gained or lost, I think it's hard to speak of a battle really being won. But the French prefer to remember his First World War period that way because it sounds a lot more glorious than reminding people that there was this large mutiny in the French army, which Pétain managed to put down.
Well, you raise a very important point of the context of World War I. That's the mass opposition to the war. Of course, much of the international left at the time said this was an inter-imperialist war. W.B. Du Bois would later say that it was a war over colonies, specifically African colonies and other colonies. We saw France and Britain carve up the former colonies of the Ottoman Empire. So let's talk more about World War I and the opposition to it. In your book, you speak a lot about the anti-war opposition. The context for all of this is, of course, that Macron and Trump now are going to be commemorating the centennial of the end of the war. It was an absolutely devastating conflict. Now it is kind of seen as the prelude to World War II. So the horrors of World War II kind of have, diminished the horrors of World War I just by the severity of the Second World War. But, the degree to which this really devastated France, Germany, and other parts of the continent, it's hard to overstate. So why do you think Macron would be looking for war heroes and generals and commemorating them as heroes rather than honoring the people who helped bring about the end to the war?
Well, unfortunately, all countries seem to like to honor military heroes and military heroics, and to assume that all of the wars they fought in were virtuous and worth fighting. But in fact, if you look back through history, I think, most of us would agree that 90% or so of wars were not worth fighting. And I certainly feel that way about the First World War. There was no reason for it. It didn't have to happen. In June 1914, all the major powers in Europe were getting along with each other quite well. Britain and Germany were each other's largest trading partners. There were 50,000 Germans working in Britain because they could earn higher salaries there than they could back in Germany. The royal families of Britain, Germany, and Imperial Russia were all cousins. They had vacationed together. And the royal families in Germany and Russia had a great deal of power, absolute power in the case of Russia. No country openly claimed a piece of the territory of another in Europe. So there was really none of the traditional reasons why wars existed. But after the Austrian Archduke was assassinated at Sarajevo, in the next 5 or 6 weeks, there was the most incredible chain of blunders, threats, ultimatums, miscalculations, and soon the whole continent was in flames. And then the war went on for 4.5 years. It caused casualties 6 times as many as any previous war in Europe had caused. It left large swaths of the continent devastated because as armies retreated, They left scorched earth behind them, blowing up buildings, poisoning wells, cutting down fruit trees, so there would be nothing useful to the enemy advancing into that territory. So you had this immense devastation, not to mention more than 9 million soldiers killed, some 21 million wounded, millions more civilians who died, and then above all, this reservoir of bitterness and resentment that was left behind in Germany, which Hitler manipulated very skillfully to gain power. And I think it's hard to imagine the Second World War and the Holocaust happening without the first. The devastation it left behind, the need for scapegoats, and so on. So at this Armistice Day anniversary that's coming up, I'd like to see war resistors honored rather than people like Marshal Pétain who fought the war.
Yeah, and let's talk more about World War II now. Pétain wasn't just a passive leader during the Vichy regime. He, in fact, organized a volunteer brigade to fight alongside the Nazi German army against the Soviet Union. And he raised a militia to help repel allies who were landing to try to fight for the liberation of France. So do you believe that Macron is trying to honor him not just because of his World War I role, but also as a way of maybe trying to appease and reach out to far-right voters, as we saw Marine Le Pen do in the previous election?
I have no idea what was in Macron's mind, because you're right that Pétain did all those things you mentioned. In addition, he ran a very authoritarian right-wing regime that was sort of, he's imagined President Trump in power in France during that time without having any checks and balances on him. That's the kind of regime that Pétain ran. What was in Macron's mind in honoring him, I do not know. I would at least give Macron credit that this week he's also assembled world leaders in Paris on the anniversary to have a little peace forum, I think he's calling it, trying to use the anniversary to say we need to talk about mechanisms to make sure that a world war like the one that ended 100 years ago doesn't break out today. I think that's a good thing to do. Notably, President Trump, the last I saw in the news, when he goes to Paris, is going to snub the peace forum and just meet with Macron and go to a ceremony honoring the American troops. And I suspect Trump wants to see another military parade because he so much enjoyed that Bastille Day parade in Paris a year ago that he wanted one of his own in Washington.
Yeah, and let's shift a little bit. I want to talk more about the history of French colonialism, because it's not just the history of World War I and World War II that Macron is whitewashing. He's also done this for France's colonial past. Recently, in fact, on a visit to Algeria, Macron told a young Algerian that it's, quote, time to move on, rather than acknowledge the crimes committed by France for over 100 years of colonial rule. And Pétain plays a role in this as well, because French colonies played a big role, not just for France, but for the Nazis during World War II. So do you think that there is a kind of similar attitude toward the role of France as you know, a Nazi-occupied and collaborating regime in World War II, and also the kind of indifference toward the 100 years of crimes committed by French colonialism in North Africa?
I certainly think in all of the European countries that were former colonial powers, France, Britain, Germany, Spain, Portugal, Italy, there is a great deal of indifference towards what those colonial regimes were actually like and how brutal they were. And you can say exactly the same thing about the United States, because we had a colonial empire of sorts, which we won from Spain in 1898. And the Philippines were an American colony for half a century. Filipino independence advocates fought a war in vain, 1899 to 1902 or so, trying to gain their independence. It was repressed with enormous brutality. Hundreds of thousands of Filipinos were killed. Torture was routine. And this is the kind of thing that is totally absent from American high school history books. And to some degree, you can say the same about the experience of colonization as it's remembered and thought about by Europeans. Pétain played a role in that. He led French forces in an anti-colonial war, or in a war suppressing a rebellion in Morocco in the 1920s. And the military forces of France were deeply engaged in fighting colonial wars in Morocco, then in Algeria during the 50s and 60s. Pétain was not involved in that, of course. And in Indochina, where we followed up and took over that war from them, so to speak.
All right, and then concluding here, I'm wondering if you could just talk a bit about this commemoration that we're seeing. You said that it would be much more appropriate on the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I to honor those who resisted the war. So we'll see that Donald Trump will likely be giving a speech. He's attending the ceremony this weekend. If you could tell Donald Trump, and he would actually listen, which is of course up in the air, but if you could tell him to say anything for this speech commemorating the end of the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I, what would you say to commemorate the end of this war on the centennial?
I'd say, looking back at this war, which remade the world for the worse in every conceivable way, I'd like to see all of us honor the people who understood at the time that it was going to do that, and who refused to fight or supported those who refused to fight. In France, Jean Jaurès, the great socialist leader, opposed the war that he saw coming, spoke out very forcefully against it, went just before the fighting began to Brussels and met with the leader of Germany's Socialist Party and declared, "We'll never make war on each other." Because of that, when he came back to France, he was assassinated, and the war began several days later. In England, the country's greatest philosopher, Bertrand Russell, the country's greatest investigative journalist, Edmund Dean Morel, both of them were sent to prison for 6 months for their opposition to the war. Here in the United States, many people spoke out against the war. Jane Addams, the pioneer social worker, Eugene Debs, the Socialist Party leader and railway union leader, spoke out against the war after the United States entered it. And for this, he was sent to prison. And he was still in prison in November 1920 when he received nearly 1 million votes for president on the Socialist Party ticket. Emma Goldman, the great anarchist leader, organized against the draft. For that, she was sent to prison for 2 years. And when she was put on trial for this, she was extremely eloquent. She told the jury, when she was accused of being unpatriotic, she said, "My patriotism is like that of a man who loves a woman, who is enchanted by her beauty, but who sees her faults clearly." And I think that's what patriotism should be like. And these are the people I think need to be honored on Armistice Day.
Well, thank you so much for providing your very interesting and informative analysis. We were speaking with Adam Hochschild, who is a renowned historian, journalist, and author. He is the author of 9 books. His latest, Lessons from a Dark Time and Other Essays, was just published this October. And he also has a book on the topic of our discussion today, World War I. That was published back in 2011, and it's called To End All Wars, A Story of Loyalty and Rebellion, 1914 to 1918. Thanks a lot, Adam.
Okay, thank you, Ben. It was a pleasure.
Anytime, and we'd love to have you back. For the Real News Network, I'm Ben Norton.